Shalom Aleichem, everybody. A good Erev Pesach. I wanted to share with you a bit of an idea, thought. I actually said this over in my shul on Leil HaSeder in shul. Didn't have the opportunity to record that. And I wanted to share with you an idea, an important idea, and develop an idea that is certainly comes up when it comes to Chag Pesach, and really to get a tap into what the Leil HaSeder is all about. Just to get us started, Rav Soloveitchik, in a lecture in 1969, he expressed the following: as a child, I vividly sensed the presence of God on two different occasions, on the night of Kol Nidre and at the Seder on the first two nights of Pesach. Rav Soloveitchik already highlights a profound sense of connecting to Hashem, and perhaps a linkage between the Leil HaSeder and Yom Kippur and Kol Nidre night. Indeed, Sfarim point out that both of these Chagim are inaugurated with the word Kol, with a certain cleansing of Kol Nidre that we start Yom Kippurim with, and Kol Chamira v'Chamia, getting rid of our chametz, and both starting with the word Kol. Perhaps no coincidence, on these two nights we go ahead and wear a kittel, linking the two and highlighting the seriousness of the evening, the seriousness obviously of Yom Kippur, but the seriousness of Chag Pesach is a way of connecting to that sense of Hashem, that sense of Shechina, building our connection to Ribono Shel Olam in that fashion. Again, you have these subtle but perhaps important links between Yom Kippurim and Chag Pesach. But I wanted to discuss there's a certain what I'll call a dichotomy, there's certain schizophrenia perhaps that we feel when it comes to Chag Pesach. And indeed, the Abarbanel points out that when it comes to the Manishtana itself, we highlight four questions, but there are many different things that we do on Pesach that we don't do other Yom Tovim. And why Dafka does the Manishtana highlight these four questions? The question of why we go ahead and have matzah, not chametz, we have mesubin, moror, etc. Why these four specifically? And the Abarbanel says that really all four questions in the Manishtana are really highlighting one fundamental idea, and that is the contradiction that seems to emerge throughout Chag Pesach. On the one hand, we are B'nei Chorim, and we go ahead and eat Beheseba. On the other hand, Moror, we go ahead and reflect the Avodim Hayinu, the Merirus that we have. And again, there's a certain dichotomy, there's a certain schizophrenia, as I mentioned, that we feel on this night, and that's really what the Manishtana is highlighting. What exactly is the resolution of this conflict? In fact, when you look at the eatings that we do at the Leil HaSeder, like any Jewish celebration, there's a lot of food involved, but you focus on the food that we eat, and again, this dichotomy of, on the one hand, the Cherus, on the other hand, the Avdus, really permeates and adheres in all of the achilos that we have. Matzah, for example, the Gemara tells us in Maseches Psachim Daf Lamed Vav Med Aleph that matzah is called, in the Chumash it's called Lechem Oni. And the Gemara has different drushes why we call it Lechem Oni, what exactly is the message that the Torah is trying to convey. And on the one hand, it is Lechem Ani, it is poor man's bread, and that's why we break the matzah. We have Yachatz, because Madarko Shel Ani Beprusa, an Ani doesn't have a whole loaf, a whole piece, and therefore we reflect the Avdus, the Anidus that we feel with the matzah. On the other hand, matzah is also the bread of chipazon, the bread of cherus, that we went ahead and we left Mitzrayim in a hurry. We didn't have a chance to let the bread rise, and therefore it really represents that sense of geula, because we left Mitzrayim b'chipazon, the bread didn't have a chance to rise. So we go ahead and commemorate that sense of geula with the achilas matzah. The Gemara has the following drasha: Lechem Oni, Lechem She'onim Olav Dvarim Harba. We recite the Haggadah on the bread, and Rashi points out that we would go ahead and we're Gomer Mes HaHalel. We recite Hallel on the matzah, Lechem She'onim Olav Dvarim Harbe, and in that sense, once again, it reflects the sense of Cherus. We drink 4 cups of wine, and the yain itself also has a certain dichotomy. On the one hand, the Rambam is very clear in Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah, Perek Zayin, Halacha Tes, that the reason we go ahead and drink wine, we should have very pleasant wine that we enjoy drinking. If we're not big drinkers, so lower alcohol content. If we like it, it should be a quality wine. And the Rambam writes the reason for that is because wine is Zecher L'Cherus, and a person enjoys a certain kind of beverage, so that's a reflection of that sense of Cherus. But there's a minhag, of course, that many people have to drink red wine on Leil HaSeder, and the reason for the red wine is to commemorate the blood, the Jewish blood that is spilt, the bris milah, the dam milah, the korban pesach, and the fact that we were in peril as well. In fact, the Taz writes in Siman Tuf Ayin Beis that one of the reasons we drink red wine is because to commemorate even the blood libels that took place much later in history. But again, you have this dichotomy between the wine. On the one hand is yain shel cherus. On the other hand, red wine is also yain of abdus and commemorates the blood, the charoses. Which, again, what's charoses all about? So you take a look at the Gemara in Maseches Pesachim Daf Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara tells us two different reasons we have charoses. On the one hand, the formula of charoses, the recipe of charoses, its pigmentation, its density, its structure is zecher l'tid. It reminds us, we see it as a prop at the Leil HaSeder, reminds us of the mortar, reminds us of the bricks that were constructed, that were laid, that were prepared by Klal Yisrael, represents the Abdus. On the other hand, the Gemara also says that the Charoses is Zecher L'Tapuach. There's a special nasus performed. The Jewish women were having babies, and a lot of babies in Mitzrayim, under an apple tree, and it was a very painless labor, a pain-free labor, and Zecher L'Tapuach, that apple tree that the women used to give birth under, so that's the Zecher L'Tapuach. Once again, Geula, Nisim, and Abdus. Even Moror, you have this duality, this reflection. Certainly Moror, obviously, by Moru es Chayehem, its Moror represents the Merirus, the Avdus, the bitterness of life in Mitzrayim. On the other hand, the Gemara tells us there's a special practice to have chasa, to have lettuce, a bitter type of lettuce, as part of our kiyum of Moror. Why chasa? And the Gemara tells us in Maseches Pesachim Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, that the reason for chasa is dechos rachmana ilavon, that Hashem had mercy upon us. He went ahead and saved us. And in fact, Bizman Hazeh, the Gemara tells us Moror is only mitzvah d'Rabbanan. The only time you have Moror d'Oraisa is when it's coupled with the Korban Pesach. And again, I think that reflects this duality. Moror on a d'Oraisa level only exists when it's eaten together with Korban Pesach. Al matzos umorim yochluhu. When it comes to Moror with Pesach, you have the Geula of Korban Pesach coupled with the Moror. That's the equilibrium. That's that package that you have the Cherus of Korban Pesach and the Merirus of Moror in one package. Then you have Moror d'Oraisa. Bizman Hazeh, we don't have a Korban Pesach, so Moror only drops to a level of Drabbanan, because again, without Korban Pesach, you lose that sense of equilibrium. And that's really what this night is all about, this duality that permeates the Achilos of the evening, the Amiros of the evening, the Haggadah. And again, I want to explore that a little bit further. So you have a very well-known Gemara that tells us in Maseches Pesachim Daf Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph, the Mishnah says, Matchil b'gnus u'mesayim b'shvach. We start with gnus, and we are mesayim b'shvach. We start with the degradation, with the abdus, and then we finish with shvach, with the praise of Hashem. And the Gemara later on that same page, Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph in Maseches Pesachim, says, what's the gnus, what's the shvach? Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav Amar mitchila ovdei avodas gilulim hayu avosenu. The gnus is that we were ovdei avodas zara. Terach Avi Avram was an oved avodas zara, and we were keravnu hamakom lavodaso, and Hashem took us and we were makabel the Torah. The gnus was the story of Terach. We were ovdei avodas zara, and the climax of that, the shvach, is Hashem gave us the Torah, Kabbalas HaTorah Har Sinai. That's the position of Rav. Shmuel disagrees, and Shmuel says, no, it's a much more truncated piece of Jewish history, is that Shmuel says the gnus is avodim hayunu l'par b'mitzrayim, we were avodim, and the shvach was vayotzienu Hashem, that Hashem took us out. It's localized to the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So we have both elements. Rav says it's a function of a spiritual development from Ovdei Avodah Zarah to Kabbalas HaTorah, and Shmuel says it's a function of the physical salvation from Avdus Mitzrayim to Yetzias Mitzrayim. If you look at the Rishonim on that sugya, so the Rishonim have a machlokes. Is there really a machlokes over here? Are these just two different perspectives? Everyone agrees to both. Which one just should be the emphasis? What should be the lead? But really there's no machlokes whatsoever. We want to incorporate both the position of Rav and the position of Shmuel. Indeed, that's the feeling of the Ritva on the Sugya. The Maharal writes this as well in his Haggadah. It's just a matter of priority, but it's not a matter of a fundamental machlokas, and we do indeed incorporate both ideas into our Haggadah, and we should, and that's the position of the Ritva. The Avu Draham says, no, there's a fundamental machlokas over here, a machlokas. What exactly are we celebrating on this, the Leil HaSeder? Are we celebrating merely a physical redemption? And of course, you can't be a Ben Chorin spiritually if you don't have that sense of physical redemption, or is the Ikar that sense of a spiritual salvation climaxing with Kabbalah Satori. Take a look at the Rambam, and it's no surprise, but the Rambam writes both. He has both, and again, that's our practice. The Rambam is found in Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah, Perek Zayin Halacha Dalet. The Rambam says as follows: V'tzarich lahatchil bignus u'lesayim b'shvach. We start with the degradation, we move to the shvach. Ketzad, how exactly do we do so? Matchil mitzaper shvetchila hayu avoseinu b'mei terech kofrim v'toim achar hahevel v'rodfim achar avodah zara. We started our early history. We were non-believers. We were ovdei avodah zara. And umesayim, what's the climax? What does it lead to? Umesayim b'das ha'emes shekeravnu hamakom lo v'vdilanu min hatom v'keravnu liyichudo. The end of the story is Hashem brought us in and we left the ways of Avodah Zarah and we became Ovdei Hashem. That's step one. That's what the Rambam emphasizes, the mitzvah lesaper, to tell that story of Jewish history. And then the Rambam continues, V'chein, moreover, matchil umodia sha'avodim hayunu lepara b'mitzrayim. We also have to tell over that we were avodim lepara b'mitzrayim. And then we tell over all the nisim that were done, that Hashem made us His chosen people, and we get this from the parsha of Arami Oved Avi, and that's the position of the Rambam. He incorporates both ideas, and if you look at the Rambam also in Perek Zayin of Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah Halacha Aleph, the Rambam says similarly. There's two ideas. There's a mitzvah lesaper. There's a mitzvah lahodia. Lesaper from the story of Ovdei Avodah Zarah. And then lahodia, to also tell over the nace of avodim hayinu. What's interesting is, what exactly is the source? What's the source for this halacha of matchil bignus umesayim b'shvach? As I say, we incorporate both into our Agada, and indeed that is the position of the Rambam. But where does this come from? What exactly is the makor? So it's very, very striking. But you take a look at the Gemara in Maseches Sota. The Gemara in Sota is found on Daf Lamed Beis, and the Gemara says, Tanya Rav Shimon Bar Yochai Omer, Adam Omer Shvacho Bekol Namuch. When you praise Hashem, you do so in a lower voice. Ugnuso. And when you talk about the gnus, Bekol Ram, in a louder voice, striking. Gnus Bekol Ram, Shvach Bekol Namuch. Where do you get this from? So the Gemara says, Shvacho, that we praise, Bekol Namuch, min Vidui Meiser. That comes from the parasha of Vidui Meiser, Gnuso. And the fact that we go ahead and tell the story of the denigration of Klal Yisrael, persecution, that's Bekol Ram, loudly, in a resounding voice, mi Mikra Bikurim. From the story of Mikra Bikurim. Rashi comments, what is Mikra Bikurim? Kegon Arami Oved Avi. Dahainu Gnuso Shmisvadim Shavim Lavon Ha'arami Haya Rasha. So Rashi tells what's Mikra Bikurim. That's in Parshas Kisavo, the parsha of Arami Oved Avi, which is exactly the parsha that we go ahead and darshan at the Leil HaSeder. What's the message? What's the idea over here? What's Rashi? What's the Gemara really telling us? So I don't remember where I saw this, but I definitely saw it somewhere. It's not my idea. But apparently this vision, what is Mikra Bikurim all about? So that, you take a look at the Sefer HaChinuch, very clearly the midst of Mikra Bikurim, you have your first fruits, and you bring them up to Yerushalayim. The farmer brings his first fruit to Yerushalayim, brings it as a korban in the Beis HaMikdash, and there's a Kriyas HaParsha, tells over the story of Jewish history and how we got to this land, to Eretz Yisrael. And clearly Mikra Bikurim is a mitzvah of Hakaras Hatov, thanking Hashem for everything that He did to bring us here, to give this farmer his land in Eretz Yisrael, and he expressed that Hakaras Hatov by bringing the first produce up to Yerushalayim as a korban and expressing that sense of Hakaras Hatov. No coincidence that the same parsha of Arami Oved Avi that's part of Mikra Bikurim, that's the parsha that we read and that we darshan at the Leil HaSeder. Because what's the Leil HaSeder all about also? It's a mitzvah of Hakaras Hatov. And perhaps the message, this linkage, that we have this vision of Matchil Begnus, Mesayim B'Shvach, yes, and what the source is. It's not a halacha in Pesach. It's not a halacha in Leil HaSeder. It's a halacha in Mikra Bikurim, and more fundamentally, it's a halacha in Hakaras HaTov. Is that when you want to go and express a sense of Hakaras HaTov, you have to give the entire picture. You have to talk about where you started and where you got to. We learned that out from Mikra Bikurim. It's striking. When it comes to Mikra Bikurim, we're told the gnus, the downside, the persecution, the bad part of the story, Bekol Ram. You have to say that loudly. You have to announce that. You don't just hide that away. You don't shove it under the rug. It's a critical part of the process of that sense of Hakaras HaTov, and maybe even more profound, as we'll see in a minute. And that perhaps is the source. It's not a din in Hilchos Pesach. It's not a din in Hilchos Leil HaSeder. I wouldn't even call it a din in Mikra Bikurim. It's halacha, yes, Bikurim and the Haggadah share a lot in common. They share in common the mitzvah of Hakaras HaTov. And just like there's an idea of Matchil B'gnus Mesayim B'Shvach by Mikra Bikurim, the source, Arami Ovid Avi, so that's transplanted into the Haggadah because of the critical nature of, if you really want to express Hakaras HaTov, you have to present the entire story, the full picture, and that means emphasizing perhaps the story of where you came from, the negative parts of the story to emphasize, and again we'll see momentarily, develop that idea a little bit further.